The silence in the house had become a heavy blanket, smothering me slowly, night after night. David had been gone for 3 weeks now, with another 5 long weeks stretching out before his return from that never-ending business trip to Germany. Our home, usually filled with the comfortable murmur of our daily lives, felt vast and empty without him. I missed his booming laugh, the way he'd absent-mindedly hum while making coffee, even his snoring. But if I were truly honest with myself, the ache went deeper than just missing his presence. There was a hollowness that seemed to resonate within me, a quiet longing I couldn't quite place. Friday night found me in bed, a book lying open on my chest, the words blurring into meaningless shapes. Moonlight filtered through the thin curtains, casting pale, dancing patterns on the ceiling. My mind, however, was anything but still. It flitted from to-do lists to half-forgotten memories, always circling back to the same restless feeling. It wasn't just loneliness. It was a peculiar sort of anticipation, a sense that something was off. I shifted onto my side, trying to find a comfortable position. But the quiet hum of the house seemed to amplify my unease. 19 years. That's how old Lucas was now. A young man, no longer the little boy who used to climb into our bed during thunderstorms. He was a good kid, quiet and thoughtful. But lately, I'd noticed a certain distance, a guardedness in his eyes that I couldn't quite decipher. We still talked, of course, shared meals, but the easy camaraderie we once had felt strained. Just as I was drifting into a fitful half-sleep, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible creak. My eyes snapped open, and I held my breath, listening. There it was again, the distinct sound of my bedroom door slowly being pushed open. I sat up, my heart thumping a little faster, squinting into the dimness. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, the faint light from the hallway outlining broad shoulders. Lucas. He hesitated, one hand gripping the doorframe, his posture suggesting a profound uncertainty. He looked lost. "Mom?" His voice was quiet, hesitant, barely above a whisper. A knot tightened in my chest at the sound of his voice. "What is it, honey?" I asked softly, rubbing my eyes, trying to shake off the sleepiness. He didn't respond immediately, standing frozen in the doorway, his shadow stretching long and distorted across the room. After a moment that felt like an eternity, he took a hesitant step inside, his bare feet making soft thuds on the carpet. There was something about the way he moved, so unsure and almost fearful, that made the air in the room feel heavier, charged with an unspoken tension. "I couldn't sleep," he finally said, his voice still barely audible. I glanced at the digital clock on my nightstand. 2:17 a.m. Lucas wasn't the type to wake me in the middle of the night unless something was truly bothering him. My chest tightened with a growing sense of unease as I swung my legs over the side of the bed and motioned for him to come closer. "What's going on?" I asked gently, my voice laced with concern. He hesitated again, shuffling his feet slightly, before slowly sitting down on the very edge of the bed, as if afraid to put his full weight on it. His posture was rigid, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his gaze fixed firmly on the floor. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I watched him for a moment, the silence stretching between us, thick with unspoken words. "Lucas," I said softly, reaching out and gently placing a hand on his back. "You can talk to me. Whatever it is, I'm here." He let out a shaky breath, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his t-shirt. "It's hard to explain," he said finally, his voice still low and uncertain. "I've been feeling something. I've been feeling different, and I don't know what to do about it." His words sent a ripple of unease through me, a prickle of anxiety in the pit of my stomach. I leaned forward slightly, my voice steady despite the growing apprehension. Different how, honey? He finally looked up at me then, his eyes searching mine with an intensity that caught me off guard. It was a look I hadn't seen before, a vulnerability mixed with something else I couldn't quite name. It's about someone, he said, his voice lowering even further, almost a whisper. Someone I've been thinking about a lot. Someone you're not going to expect. A wave of relief, unexpected and almost overwhelming, flickered through me. Maybe this was just about a girl at school, a first crush he didn't know how to handle. Lucas had always been shy about his feelings, keeping them bottled up until they threatened to spill over. It was a relief to think it was something so normal. Okay, I said, offering him a reassuring smile. Who is it? Someone from school? He shook his head quickly, his gaze dropping again to the floor. No, he said, the word barely audible. It's not someone from school. My unease returned, stronger this time, a cold tendril of apprehension wrapping around my heart. Then who, honey? I pressed gently, though a strange, unsettling feeling was beginning to creep into my chest. Lucas, you can tell me whatever it is. We'll figure it out together. He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling visibly as if gathering some monumental courage. When he spoke again, his voice was trembling, barely a whisper, but the words hit me with the force of a physical blow. It's you, Mom, he said finally, his eyes locking onto mine with a raw intensity I'd never witnessed before. It's always been you. The words hung in the air between us, thick and heavy like a physical barrier I couldn't break through. For a moment, I couldn't speak, couldn't even think. My mind felt like a tangled mess of wires, sparking with disbelief and a dawning sense of horror. My son? The thought echoed in my head, a cold wave washing over me, leaving me numb. Alex? Lucas? I stammered, my voice barely a whisper, the wrong name slipping out in my shock. What? What are you saying? He stood abruptly, the tension radiating off him in palpable waves. He began to pace the small space between the bed and the dresser, like a caged animal. His hands ran through his hair, tugging at the strands as if trying to physically pull the words back into his mind. I know how it sounds, he said quickly, his voice tight with desperation. I know it's wrong, Mom. Believe me, I know. But I can't help it. I've tried. God, I've tried so hard to push it away, to ignore it. But it's always there. It's always been there. I stared at him, my heart pounding so loudly in my chest that I could barely hear his words. This isn't happening. This can't be happening. Lucas, this isn't... Don't tell me it's not real, he interrupted, his voice cracking. You know how I feel. You have to. I've never felt this way about anyone else. It's not just admiration or some stupid crush, Mom. It's something much deeper. Lucas, please, I said again, my voice trembling now, mirroring his. You're my son. What you're feeling, it's not love, it's something else. Confusion, maybe. You're young. It is love, he shouted, the word raw with emotion, tearing through the quiet of the night. You're everything to me, Mom. You're the only one who's ever truly understood me, the only one who's ever made me feel like I'm worth something. How can that not be love? Tears stung my eyes as I tried to process the torrent of his emotions. My son, my sweet boy, whom I had raised and loved unconditionally, was pouring out feelings I couldn't comprehend, feelings I certainly couldn't return. But even as my mind recoiled in disbelief, something shifted within me, a strange, unsettling mix of emotions I didn't want to acknowledge. Looking back, I think I tried to bury it instantly to pretend it wasn't there. Lucas, you're confused, I said, my voice softer now, trying to soothe him. You're going through a lot right now, with your dad being away. With everything, maybe these feelings. I'm not confused, he insisted, turning to face me, his eyes glassy with unshed tears, his jaw set with a determination that made my chest ache. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, and it was in that moment, looking into his earnest, tormented eyes, that I truly noticed it. I could feel the intensity of his gaze, the almost magnetic pull he seemed to have towards me. I didn't want to acknowledge it, didn't want to turn towards that feeling. But as his mother, I felt a desperate need to protect us both. I reached out and placed a hand on his arm, the skin beneath my fingers warm and slightly damp. "Lucas," I said gently, trying to keep my voice even, "these feelings, they'll pass. I promise you they will. And when they do, you'll see things more clearly." "What if they don't?" he whispered, his voice breaking, the raw vulnerability in his eyes piercing my heart. "What if this is who I am? What if this is how I'm supposed to feel?" My throat tightened, and for a moment I couldn't speak. I didn't have the answer he was looking for, the magic words to make his pain disappear. All I could do was hold on to the hope that time would bring clarity, that this intense, unsettling moment wouldn't define us. "You're not alone in this," I said finally, my voice trembling but trying to sound resolute. "We'll get through it, Lucas, together." He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes filled with a vulnerability that made my heart ache. "I don't want to lose you, Mom," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't lose you." "You won't," I said firmly, squeezing his arm. "No matter what, I'll always be here." A heavy silence descended upon the room again, broken only by the sound of our ragged breathing. The air felt thick with unspoken words, with the weight of his confession hanging between us. Why don't you join me tonight?" I said finally, turning back and pulling the sheets up around me. "Maybe that will help a bit." He nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on me, and then he carefully stepped into the bed, settling in beside me. I pulled him close, the familiar comfort of holding my son strangely intertwined with a new, unsettling awareness. "Good night, sweetie," I said, forcing a smile. He smiled back, a small, sad curve of his lips. The silence that followed was heavy, but not unbearable. It was the kind of silence that held unspoken promises, fragile but sincere. As he closed his eyes, I felt a glimmer of hope, a desperate wish that we could weather this storm no matter how impossible it seemed. But deep down, a knot of dread remained in my stomach. I knew this wasn't the end. A night like this, a confession like this, was bound to have repercussions. This time, nothing more had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that more was coming. Love, especially a love as complicated and forbidden as this, doesn't simply fade away. It demands to be reckoned with, and I had no idea what that reckoning would look like. The morning after Lucas's confession dawned with a surreal quiet. The usual sounds of the house, the gentle hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, seemed amplified, each tick a reminder of the unspoken truth hanging between us. Every corner, every familiar object seemed to vibrate with the residual tension from the night before. I tried to busy myself with chores, hoping the mundane routine would ground me, but my hands trembled as I folded laundry, and my mind raced with a million unanswered questions. What did this mean for us? For him? For my marriage? The scrape of a chair against the kitchen floor startled me. Lucas was sitting at the table, staring blankly at a bowl of cereal that remained untouched. His hair was messy, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. He hadn't slept, and neither had I. "Morning," I said cautiously, breaking the heavy silence as I poured myself a cup of coffee. He looked up, his expression unreadable, a mixture of vulnerability and something else I couldn't quite place. "Morning," he replied flatly. The sound of the coffee filling the mug seemed deafening in the quiet kitchen. I joined him at the table, the space between us feeling both too vast and suffocatingly close. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, the air thick with everything left unsaid. "Lucas, about last night," I began, my voice hesitant. He interrupted me, his gaze direct, though his eyes still held a hint of turmoil. "I meant what I said, Mom. I'm not going to pretend I didn't." I closed my eyes briefly, willing myself to remain calm. "I know you're being honest," I said softly, opening them again. "But Lucas, what you're feeling, it's not something we can act on. It's not something we should act on." He leaned back in his chair, his hands gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white. "Why not?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "Why does love have to fit into all these rules and boundaries? Isn't love supposed to be free?" I took a deep breath, searching for the right words, the words that would make him understand without crushing him. "Love isn't just about what we feel, Lucas," I said carefully. "It's about what's right, what's good for everyone involved. And this, what you're saying, it could hurt us both, deeply." He looked away, his jaw tightening. "I don't want to hurt you," he said quietly, almost to himself. "That's the last thing I want." "I know," I said, reaching across the table to place my hand over his. His hand was cold, his fingers stiff, "and I don't want to hurt you either. That's why we have to handle this carefully. We need to find a way to move past this." His fingers tightened around mine, a desperate grip. For a fleeting moment, I saw the boy he used to be, the little boy who'd held my hand when he was scared, who looked to me for guidance and comfort. But the intensity in his eyes now was different, a yearning that made my stomach churn. "I don't know if I can move past it," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "But I'll try, for you." Tears welled in my eyes, and I gave his hand a gentle squeeze. "That's all I ask." The days that followed were a blur of awkward conversations and forced normalcy. Lucas tried to keep his distance, retreating to his room or spending long hours away from the house. I told myself it was for the best, that the space would help him process his feelings, but I missed him. The easy rapport we'd shared before everything had changed. We still slept in the same bed every night, a silent agreement born out of habit and perhaps a lingering sense of comfort. But even in the darkness, I felt a chasm growing between us. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, I heard the front door open and close. Lucas stepped into the kitchen, his hair damp from the rain. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable, as if deciding whether to say something or simply turn and leave. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "You're just in time. Dinner's almost ready." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he walked over to the counter and leaned against it, his arms crossed over his chest. "I've been thinking," he said finally, his gaze steady. "About what?" I asked, my hands pausing in their task of chopping vegetables. "About us," he said, his gaze unwavering. "About what I said that night." I swallowed hard, bracing myself for another difficult conversation. "Of course, Lucas," I said, trying to sound calm. "I thought we agreed." "I know," he interrupted, pushing off the counter and taking a step closer. "And I'm not here to argue. I need to say this." I nodded, motioning for him to continue. My heart was pounding in my chest, a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. "I've been trying to figure out what to do with these feelings," he said, his voice low but firm. "And I realized something. I don't want to lose what we have, Mom, even if it's not what I want it to be. I'd rather have you in my life as my mom than risk losing you completely." A wave of relief washed over me, so potent it almost made me weak. but it was tempered by the sadness in his voice, the unspoken longing that still lingered in his eyes. "Lucas, you're not going to lose me," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "No matter what, I'll always be here for you." He nodded, his lips pressed into a thin line. "I know," he said softly, "but it's hard, Mom. It's really hard." I stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm, mirroring the gesture from the night of his confession. "It's going to take time," I said gently, "but you're strong, Lucas, and I'll help you through this, however I can." His eyes met mine, and for a moment, the heavy tension that had been suffocating us seemed to ease, replaced by a fragile understanding. "Thanks, Mom," he said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "That means a lot." We stood there in the kitchen, the rain tapping softly against the windows, a gentle rhythm in the quiet. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope, a fragile belief that maybe, just maybe, we were going to be okay. But life, as it often does, had a way of throwing unexpected curves. Just when I thought we'd found some semblance of peace, something happened that threatened to unravel everything we had tentatively rebuilt. The uneasy truce Lucas and I had established held for a time, fragile but functional. He made an effort to smile more, to laugh at my jokes, to join me for meals like he used to. I clung to those moments, convincing myself that things were slowly returning to normal. But late at night, when the house was silent and I was alone with my thoughts, the weight of his confession and my own confusing emotions still lingered. One evening, after a long and tiring day, I found Lucas in the living room. He was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the television screen. An old sitcom played, its canned laughter echoing awkwardly in the otherwise quiet room. He looked up as I walked in, his expression unreadable. "You okay?" I asked, sitting down beside him, leaving a small space between us. He shrugged, his gaze returning to the screen. "Yeah, just thinking." I hesitated, unsure whether to press him or let it go. "About anything in particular?" He let out a soft, humorless laugh. "What am I not thinking about?" My stomach twisted. "Lucas, I thought we were moving past this." "I'm trying, Mom," he said quickly, turning to face me, his eyes pleading. "I really am, but it's not that simple. You can't just turn feelings off like a switch." "I know," I said softly, reaching out and gently touching his knee. "And I don't expect you to, but we have to keep working on this for both our sakes." He turned to face me fully, his eyes searching mine with an intensity that made me slightly breathless. "Have you ever thought about it?" he asked suddenly, his voice low and husky. "About what, honey?" I asked, my heart beginning to pound in my chest. "About us," he said, his gaze unwavering. "About what it would be like if things were different." I froze, caught completely off guard by his directness. My mind raced, trying to find the right words, the safe words. "Lucas, don't lie to me," he pleaded, his tone more desperate than demanding. "Just tell me the truth." I turned away, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The truth was complicated, tangled in feelings I couldn't fully comprehend, feelings I had tried so hard to suppress. Of course I had thought about it. How could I not, after everything he'd said? But to admit those thoughts, even to myself, felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. "It doesn't matter what I've thought," I finally said, forcing my voice to remain even. "What matters is doing the right thing. And this isn't right." He sighed, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "I know you think that, but what if—" "No, Lucas," I interrupted firmly, turning back to face him. "There is no what if. We're not having this conversation." He stared at me for a long moment. his face a mixture of frustration and a deep, aching sadness. "You're scared," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, I am," I admitted, my voice trembling slightly. And it was true. I was scared, but not just for the reasons I was articulating. I was afraid to tell him that over the past couple of weeks, in the quiet moments, in the brief touches, I had felt something too. Something I was terrified to acknowledge, even to myself. He didn't respond, and the silence that followed was deafening. Finally, he stood up, his movement stiff and deliberate. "I'm going for a walk," he said, heading towards the front door. "Lucas," I started, but he was already gone, the door closing softly behind him. Hours passed slowly, each minute dragging like an eternity. I sat by the window, watching the street, my worry mounting with every passing moment. The sky outside had darkened, and the streetlights cast long, lonely shadows. Lucas didn't return. It wasn't until nearly midnight that I heard the soft click of the front door. Relief flooded through me as I rushed to the entryway and saw him step inside, soaked to the bone from the rain. "Lucas, where have you been?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of relief and lingering fear. "Walking," he said simply, shaking the water from his hair like a wet dog. I grabbed a towel from the bathroom and handed it to him. "You're going to get sick," I said, my worry spilling over into a gentle scolding. He sighed, a hint of irritation flickering in his eyes. "You can't just disappear like that, Lucas. I was worried sick." "I needed to clear my head," he said, running the towel roughly over his face. "Did it help?" I asked, crossing my arms, trying to appear stern but my heart still pounding in my chest. He looked at me, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Not really," he said quietly, the exhaustion evident in his voice. Something in his tone made my resolve falter. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "Lucas, we can't keep going like this. It's tearing us both apart." "I know," he whispered, his voice barely audible, raw with a pain that mirrored my own. "But I don't know how to stop." "Maybe we need help," I suggested tentatively. "Someone to talk to, a therapist." His lips twisted into a bitter smile. "You think a therapist will understand this?" "They might," I said, though a part of me doubted it. "Or at least help us figure out how to move forward." He shook his head, the towel dropping to the floor with a soft thud. "No one can fix this, Mom. No one can change how I feel." His words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, that time and distance would heal this wound. But deep down, a terrifying truth echoed his words. And the worst part was, I still hadn't fully admitted to him, or even to myself, the extent of my own conflicted feelings. I was still lying, still trying to avoid the messy, complicated reality of our situation. The next few days passed in a blur of avoidance and strained politeness. Lucas tried to act normal, but the tension between us was palpable, a thick, invisible wall separating us even when we were in the same room. Every interaction felt like walking on a tightrope, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to snap. That something came one evening as we were cleaning up after dinner. Lucas had been unusually quiet all day, his movements tense and deliberate. As I loaded the dishwasher, he leaned against the counter, watching me, his gaze intense. "Mom," he said suddenly, his voice breaking the strained silence. "I need to tell you something." I turned to face him, my heart pounding in my chest. "What is it, honey?" "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice trembling. "I can't keep pretending everything's fine." "Lucas, we've talked about this," I began, my voice laced with a plea for him to stop. But he shook his head, his eyes filled with a desperate urgency. "No, you don't understand," he said, his voice rising slightly. "I can't just turn off how I feel. I can't keep pretending I'm okay when I'm not." Then what do you want me to do? I asked, my own frustration bubbling to the surface. What do you expect me to say? I don't know, he said, his voice cracking, the raw emotion tearing through his carefully constructed facade. I just need you to see me, Mom, to understand how much this is tearing me apart. I do see you, Lucas, I said, my own voice trembling now. I see you every day, and it breaks my heart to see you like this. But I don't know how to fix it. He took a step closer, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. You can't fix it, he said softly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. But maybe we don't have to. I stared at him, my mind reeling, trying to decipher the unspoken words hanging in the air between us. Lucas, what are you saying? He didn't answer with words. Instead, he closed the remaining distance between us, his hand brushing lightly against mine. My breath caught in my throat, and the air between us suddenly felt thick, electric. But the moment didn't last. A jolt of fear, of reality, shot through me, and I instinctively stepped back, breaking the fragile connection. No, I said firmly, my voice shaking. We can't. We can't. His face crumpled, pain etched into every line. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears, before turning and walking away, disappearing down the hallway and into his room. I stood there in the kitchen, my heart racing, the weight of what had just happened crashing down on me, because no matter how much I tried to deny it, something inside me, a dangerous, forbidden part of me, had responded to him in that brief, fleeting moment of contact, and that terrified me more than anything. I thought back to the nights we had spent sleeping in the same bed since his confession. I'd noticed he'd been touching me more often, a hand lingering on my shoulder, a brush of his leg against mine, and I realized, with a jolt, that I had been doing the same, a comforting touch that had started to feel different. I think he had noticed it too, and that's why he had pushed, why he had dared to close the gap between us. The days after that moment in the kitchen were like walking through a storm, unpredictable and overwhelming. Lucas and I avoided each other more than ever. When we did cross paths, the silence between us spoke louder than any words. I told myself it was for the best, that the space was what we both needed. But the truth was, every time I saw him retreat to his room, every time I caught the flash of pain in his eyes, it tore at me. I spent nights replaying the scene in the kitchen over and over in my head. The way he looked at me, the weight of his unspoken desire, and the terrifying flicker of recognition within myself. It wasn't right. It wasn't. But denying the complexity of what we were feeling only seemed to deepen the wound. One evening, as I sat in the living room with a book I couldn't focus on, Lucas came in. He hesitated at the doorway, unsure if he was welcome, his hair messy, his expression guarded. This was the moment. I knew it. I had to say something, had to acknowledge the elephant in the room. Lucas, I said softly, my voice quieter than usual. He looked up, trying to keep his expression neutral. Hey, he replied, stepping further into the room but not sitting, pacing slowly near the edge of the coffee table. I wanted to talk, I said, glancing at him briefly before looking away, my hands twisting in my lap. I know things have been hard for both of us. He nodded slowly, closing the book I had been pretending to read and setting it aside. They have. But Mom, he said, stopping his pacing and turning to face me, his eyes earnest. I don't want you to think I don't care. I do, more than you know. I know you care, honey, I said, my voice thick with emotion. That's why this is so hard. Because no matter how much I try to let go, no matter how much I tell myself to move on, I trailed off, unable to articulate the confusing mess of my own feelings. Mom, he began, taking a step closer. I held up my hand, stopping him. "Let me finish," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I've spent so much time trying to figure out what's wrong with me, why I feel this connection with you, but the more I think about it, the more I realize it's not wrong to feel love, Lucas. Love it just is, even if it doesn't fit the rules, even if it scares people." I swallowed hard, my own words striking something deep inside me. "Love isn't wrong," I said carefully, meeting his gaze. "But sometimes acting on it is, especially when it could hurt the people we care about." He nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer but needed to hear it anyway. "I get that," he said softly. "I do. But what am I supposed to do with these feelings, Mom? Just bury them? Pretend they don't exist?" "No," I said finally, shaking my head. "You don't have to pretend. And I need to confess something too." I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest. "You might have already noticed it, a little. For the last couple of nights, while we were sleeping together." For a moment he didn't respond, his expression a mixture of confusion and anticipation. Then, to my surprise, a small, quiet laugh escaped his lips. "Your touches," he asked softly, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "Of course I noticed, Mom. I told myself you were just doing that to make me feel good, to be honest." His smile faded, replaced by a look of intense vulnerability. "They only made me feel more lost. They made me feel so close to what I want, but yet so far away." "You're not lost, Lucas," I said, leaning forward slightly, my voice gentle. "You're just finding your way. And that's okay. It's part of growing up." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a vulnerability that made my chest ache. "I don't want to lose you, Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't lose you." "You won't," I said firmly, my voice unwavering despite the turmoil inside me. "No matter what, I'm here. That will never change." At that moment, my heart was pounding in my chest. I still hadn't told him the full truth, that those touches weren't just for his benefit, that they were a reflection of my own confusing and forbidden desires. I knew I had to be careful, to guide him without leading us down a path we couldn't come back from. "But let me finish what I was going to say, Lucas," I continued, my voice softer now. "Those touches, they weren't just to make you feel good. They what, Mom?" he asked, his eyes searching mine, filled with a desperate hope. I took another deep breath, the words catching in my throat. "I did that because I felt something too, Lucas," I confessed, my voice barely a whisper. "In fact, I still feel something. I was scared to tell you because I'm your mom, and it feels wrong. It shouldn't be true, what we feel for each other, but I can't deny it." He stayed silent for a moment, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and something else I couldn't quite read. Then slowly, he leaned towards me, reaching out and gently taking my hand. "Mom," he whispered, his thumb tracing circles on the back of my hand. The simple touch sent a wave of warmth through me, a dangerous warmth that threatened to melt away all my carefully constructed defenses. Just then, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway cut through the tense silence. My head snapped up, my heart leaping into my throat. David was home.